In 1628, the most powerful warship in the Baltic Sea sailed 1,400 yards, met a breeze light enough that one man could hold a sheet by hand, leaned over, and sank. She was still in sight of the city that built her. The water was flat. The voyage had lasted about 20 minutes. That is usually where the story stops. The Vasa, the vanity project. A king who wanted too many guns and got what he deserved. It is taught in management courses as a parable about changing your mind halfway through, and it has been taught that way since roughly 1980. The ship disagrees. She was raised in 1961 and she floated. Between 2007 and 2011, that hull was surveyed by laser, some 80,000 measured points, and the survey found no major change during construction at all. Nobody moved the goalposts. Nobody bolted a gun deck on at the last minute. The measurements were approved by the king, the ship was built to them, and the fault was inside them from the first day. The fault is this. To stand up under her own guns, this ship needed more than twice the stone ballast she was carrying. There was nowhere left in the hold to put it, and every ton of it would have eaten into the 3 feet 11 inches between her lower gunports and the sea. On the 20th of September, 1625, the Swedish Navy lost 10 ships in a single storm in the Bay of Riga. Sweden was at war with Poland, and the king, Gustavus Adolphus, had just lost a tenth of his fleet in one night to weather. 8 months earlier, he had signed a contract for 4 new ships with a Dutch master shipwright working in Stockholm, Henrik Hybertsen. After the storm, that contract stopped being a building program and became an emergency. On the 5th of August, 1626, under 5 months into construction, he put his order for 72 24-pounders on the record. That is the 2-deck armament, and it is dated early. Early enough to design for. So the guns were not a surprise. What nobody knew was what to do about them. There is no drawing of the Vasa. No plan, no specification, not a sketch. None has ever been found for any version of her, and it is unlikely one ever existed. That is not carelessness. In 1626, a warship was not designed on paper. It was built out of proportion, ratios a master carried in his head, learned from another master, adjusted by eye against a hull that had worked before. Inside that method there was no way to ask the question that killed this ship. Whether a hull stands up under sail depends on where its weight sits relative to where its buoyancy sits, and on a shape underwater that changes as the ship leans. Working that out requires a piece of mathematics called the metacenter. The metacenter was published in 1746 by a Frenchman named Pierre Bourgaire. 118 years after this ship sank. So there was no calculation. There was proportion and there was one test: load the ship, try to make her roll and watch. Empirical, crude, and as we will see, entirely adequate. And one more thing was missing. Hybertsen had never built a ship with 2 enclosed gun decks. Neither had anyone else in Sweden. The proportions he was working from came from ships with 1. The version you have probably heard is that the king kept meddling, that the ship was laid down small, then stretched, then ordered to carry a second gun deck she was never designed for, until the thing was doomed. It is a very good story. Requirements creep, sunk cost, nobody willing to tell the boss. It is why this shipwreck turns up in software engineering lectures. The hull does not support it. Fred Hocker, who runs research at the museum the ship now lives in, puts the problem somewhere much less dramatic. The deck structure is simply heavier than it needed to be for the guns she actually carried. Overbuilt, not overruled. One change is documented, and it comes from sworn testimony. Heine Jakobsen, who took over when Hybertsen fell ill, told the inquest that he had widened the ship by 1 foot 5 inches, and that by then, construction was too far along to widen her any further. That is the opposite of the story everyone tells. The one alteration we can prove was somebody trying to fix her. He was right about the direction. He ran out of ship. By the summer of 1628, the hull was in the water and nearly everything about it was settled. The keel was laid and could not be relayed. The beam was fixed, and Jakobsen had already spent what widening was available. The guns were the entire point of the ship. The carved and gilded oak covering her stern was the king's, and it weighed what it weighed. One number was still free. Ballast. Ballast is stone in the bottom of the hold. It does nothing except sit low and hold the ship upright, and it was the only weight anybody could still add, subtract, or move. Against it, 60 tons of bronze gun, most of it high in the ship on 2 decks, oak beams heavier than the job required, and several tons of sculpture at the stern. They put in about 120 tons of stone. Sources disagree on that figure. One account says 72. It does not matter which is right, and that is worth sitting with. Both numbers are too small by more than half. The keel was long and shallow for its length. A shallow keel does not leave much depth beneath the floor of the hold, and the timbers bracing that keel took up part of what depth there was. The estimate made since the salvage is that this ship needed more than twice the ballast she carried. Call it 240 tons, where 120 went in. There was no room for the difference. Now suppose there had been. Every ton you add to make her stand up straighter also pushes her further into the water, and the lower gun ports, the ones cut for 24-pounders, sat 3 feet 11 inches above the waterline. Work her waterplane and another 120 tons puts her roughly a foot deeper. That is a reconstruction, not a document. But a foot out of 3 feet 11 inches is a quarter of the entire margin between her gun deck and the sea, spent buying stability she would still not have had enough of. 3 feet 11 inches is the whole margin. It is the distance between a warship and an open hull. So the ship had 2 requirements, and they were subtracting from each other. To be stable, she needed weight low down. To fight, she needed her lower gun ports above the sea. Ballast is the only thing that answers the first, and the only thing that destroys the second. She was a hull that could carry the guns, or carry the ballast for the guns. Not both. And nothing on board was going to say so, because the arithmetic did not exist yet. Run the geometry from her published dimensions, 3 feet 11 inches of freeboard, 38 feet of beam, and the ports touch the water at about 12 degrees of lean. That is a reconstruction, not a document, but the calculations made after the salvage arrived next door. This ship was finished at about 10 degrees. 10 degrees is not a storm. 10 degrees is a gust. This is the shape the fatal compromise usually takes. Not a blunder. A hull dimensioned for what it was told to carry, approved by everyone, built to what was approved, and disqualified from the job by a physical relationship nobody in the country had the tools to see. Except that somebody did see it. Once 5 weeks before she sailed, without any tools at all. In early July 1628, at the quay in Stockholm, Captain Hansen arranged a demonstration for Vice Admiral Claes Fleming. 30 men lined up on the upper deck and ran from one side of the ship to the other and back. That is the whole test. Move weight across the beam and watch how far she goes over and how she comes back. They completed 3 passes. A Fleming stopped it. The ship was rolling so hard that the men watching believed she would capsize where she stood, tied to the quay in harbour. The ship's master told the inquest, months later, that he heard the Vice Admiral say one thing. If only His Majesty were at home. Some retellings give a Fleming a longer line, that he told the boatswain she was carrying too much ballast, that the gun ports were too near the water. That version is not in the inquest record. What is in the record is the short one, and the short one is worse. It is not a diagnosis. It is a man realizing that the only person who could stop this is away at a war, and that nobody present is going to write to him. Nobody wrote. The master admitted at the inquest that he had kept it to himself, and that he feared the king's displeasure. Understand what that means. The single instrument for stability available in 1628 was used on this ship, produced the correct answer, and was witnessed by the second-ranking officer of the Navy. The method was not the failure. The method worked. Sunday afternoon between 4 and 5 o'clock. 4 sails set. The wind was so light that the crew could not pull the sheets out under sail pressure. They had to push them out by hand, and one man was enough to hold a sheet. That is testimony from a lieutenant who was aboard. She was warped along the waterfront on her anchors until she caught the current, and came out barely answering the helm. A gust caught her and she heeled to port, and she came back up. Slowly. Then she passed the gap in the bluffs at Itagelviken, where the wind funnels through, and a second gust laid her over, and this time the open lower gunports went under. 1,400 yards from where she started, in front of the city, in a breeze, the most expensive object Sweden had ever built rolled onto her side and went to the bottom in 105 feet of water. Most of the crew got off. About 30 people did not, and most of them were inside her. The gunports had been left open. Closed, the water could not have got in, and that decision belongs to the captain, who was in a cell the following morning. But it is not the reason. A warship exists to fight with its gunports open. A ship that can only float with them shut is not a warship, and closing them that afternoon would have bought this hull one more voyage on the way to the same ending. The inquest sat on the 5th of September, 1628. It went looking for a guilty man and could not construct one. The captain was cleared, the ship went over in a breeze, and no seamanship answers that. The builders had worked to Hybertson's design, and the king had approved it. Hybertson had been dead a year and could not be asked what he intended. Asked directly why the ship had sunk, the business partner who signed the contract answered, "Only God knows." The finding was that she lacked the belly to carry what was on top of her. That is correct, and in 1628 it is useless, because nobody could say how much belly was enough. Nobody was punished. Several of the men questioned were promoted. Here is what makes this ship different from every other machine in this series. It still exists. She went down in cold, near fresh water, in a sheltered harbor, where the shipworm that eats wooden wrecks in salt water does not live. The failure that killed her is the reason she was preserved. In 1961 they sealed the gunports, pumped her out, and she came up and floated, about 98% original timber. And then they measured her and she started answering questions. She is asymmetric. The port side is heavier than the starboard. 4 rulers were recovered, used by the men who built her, 2 calibrated in Swedish feet of 12 inches, 2 in Amsterdam feet of 11. Different crews working the 2 sides of the same hull to 2 different definitions of a foot. The center of gravity is too high. The deck beams are heavier than the guns required. The hold is exactly as shallow as the ballast estimate says it was. And there is one more piece of evidence, and it closes the case. The year after the sinking, Heine Jakobsen launched the next ship. Same builder, same yard, same navy, same guns. She was called Eplet, and her wreck was found near Stockholm in 2021. She was 3 feet 6 inches wider. 3 feet 6 inches of beam, about 100 tons more displacement, and a hold with somewhere to put it. Nobody had invented the meta center. Nobody could calculate a thing. But the man who ran out of ship in 1627 built the next one wider, and it stayed upright for 30 years, until it was worn out and deliberately sunk to block a channel. That is what the whole disaster was worth. 3 feet 6 inches, learned the only way it could be learned. A Vasa was not sunk by a king's vanity, or a bad shipwright, or requirements arriving too late. She was sunk by 2 requirements that could not both be met in the same hull, in a century with no way to discover that until the hull was in the water and full of stone. The test that would have caught it existed. It was run. It worked. The only thing missing was anyone with the standing to act on 30 men running across a deck.